The email went company-wide at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I sent it from my personal laptop, sitting in my car in the parking garage on level 3. And I watched the delivery confirmation appear on my screen with the same calm I'd used to debug production systems at 2 a.m. for 15 years. By 9:52, my phone had 43 notifications. By 10:15, it had stopped counting. By 10:30, someone had screenshotted it and posted it to LinkedIn, where it accumulated 340,000 impressions before the end of the business day. I didn't see any of that in real time. I was already on the 101 heading south, the windows down, the kind of quiet in the car that only exists when you've finally stopped carrying something very heavy. My name is Priya Venkataraman. I'm 43 years old. For 15 years, I was a senior software engineer at Helix Systems Group, a mid-sized enterprise software company headquartered in Santa Clara, California, that built workflow automation platforms for healthcare and financial services clients. I joined Helix in 2009 when the company had 180 employees and a product that worked about 70% of the time. When I left, it had 1,400 employees and a product that worked because of 3 systems I had personally architected: the Orion Data Integrity Framework, which reduced our clients' data error rates from 8.3% to 0.4% across 47 enterprise deployments, the Cascade Deployment Pipeline, which cut our average release cycle from 22 days to 4 days and eliminated the quarterly outage pattern that had been costing us client renewals since 2014, and the Sentinel Compliance Engine, which I built in 9 months to meet HIPAA and SOC 2 Type 2 requirements for our healthcare vertical, and which directly enabled $34 million in new contract signings in 2021 alone. I had a 97.2% on-time delivery rate across 312 project milestones over 15 years. I had mentored 23 junior engineers, 11 of whom were promoted to senior roles. I had not taken a full week of vacation since 2020. I missed my father's 70th birthday dinner in Chennai because we had a critical deployment for a hospital system in Ohio that couldn't slip, and I was the only person who understood the Orion framework well enough to manage it live. My manager at the time, a good man named David Osei, had said, "Priya, I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you." He meant it. He just didn't have the authority to make it up in any way that mattered. I tell you these things not to establish my credentials. The systems speak for themselves, and systems don't lie, but because what happened next only makes sense if you understand what 15 years of that kind of investment looks like. It looks like a person who has given a company the best hours of the best years of her life, who has built the infrastructure that other people's careers run on, and who has done it quietly, without demanding recognition, because she believed, genuinely, completely believed, that the work was the argument. That competence was its own advocacy. That if you built something indispensable, the people above you would eventually notice and respond accordingly. I was wrong about that. Specifically, I was wrong about the word accordingly. His name was Brandon Whitfield. He was 31 years old. He was the nephew of Helix Systems Group CEO Richard Whitfield, a fact that was not disclosed in the company-wide announcement of his hiring, but that was known to every person in the engineering department within 48 hours of his arrival. Because Brandon mentioned it himself, casually, in his first team introduction meeting, the way people mention things they believe are assets rather than liabilities. He had a master's degree in computer science from USC, which is a perfectly respectable credential for a person entering the industry at 22. Brandon was entering at 31, with 4 years of experience at 2 startups that had both folded, a LinkedIn profile that listed full-stack development as a skill despite his inability to explain the difference between a REST API and a GraphQL endpoint without consulting his phone, and a confidence that I can only describe as architectural, load-bearing, structural, entirely independent of any foundation. He wore slim-fit blazers to an office where the dress code was effectively whatever doesn't have visible stains. Not because he was formal. He wasn't formal. He was performatively casual in the way that requires significant effort, but because the blazers were a signal. They said, "I am not a peer. I am a category." He mispronounced Kubernetes as Kubernetes in a technical review meeting and then, when gently corrected by a junior engineer named Aisha Okafor, said, "Right, yeah, that's what I said." With the serenity of a man who had never been wrong about anything because no one in his life had been positioned to tell him so. He used phrases like leverage the technical bandwidth, synergize the deployment ecosystem, and, memorably, we need to optimize the code's emotional intelligence, which is not a thing, and which he said in a planning meeting with 4 senior engineers who all looked at their laptops simultaneously in the particular way that engineers look at their laptops when they are choosing not to say what they are thinking. I was not in that meeting. I was in a different meeting, being told by my manager, not David Osei, who had left Helix in 2022 for a director role at a healthcare startup, but his replacement, a VP of engineering named Craig Hollister, who had been at the company for 14 months and who managed with the particular style of someone who had learned leadership from a podcast, that Brandon Whitfield had been appointed senior technical lead for the enterprise healthcare division, the role I had been formally pursuing for 8 months. The role that David Osei had told me, in writing, in a performance review dated March 2023, that I was the natural and obvious candidate for when it opened. The role that would have represented the first title change in my 15 years at Helix, not because I hadn't earned advancement earlier, but because I had spent 15 years believing that the work was the argument. Craig delivered the news in conference room 4B on the second floor, a glass-walled room with a view of the parking structure and a whiteboard that still had my architecture diagram for the Sentinel Compliance Engine on it from a presentation I'd given 2 weeks earlier. He sat across from me with his hands flat on the table and said, "Priya, we've decided to go in a different direction for the senior technical lead role. Brandon brings a fresh perspective and some exciting ideas about where we want to take the division strategically." Fresh perspective. I looked at the whiteboard behind him. My handwriting. My system. My 15 years. What ideas? I said. Craig blinked. Sorry. What ideas does Brandon have about the division's strategic direction? Specifically. A pause. The kind of pause that contains an answer. He's still developing his vision. But Richard, the CEO, feels strongly that Brandon's energy and approach align with where Helix is headed. Richard, the CEO, Brandon's uncle. There it was, dressed in the language of strategic alignment and fresh perspective, wearing a slim-fit blazer it hadn't earned. "I see," I said. "We'd like you to support Brandon's onboarding. Given your institutional knowledge, you'd be invaluable in helping him get up to speed on the Orion and Sentinel systems." Invaluable. The word they use when they want your knowledge without your title or your compensation. You want me to train my replacement. We want you to support the team's success. Craig said it with the practiced smoothness of someone who had rehearsed the distinction. Brandon is your peer, not your replacement. Your role isn't changing. My role wasn't changing. I had built 3 systems that the company's $34 million healthcare vertical ran on, and my role wasn't changing. Brandon Whitfield had mispronounced Kubernetes, and my role wasn't changing. I had missed my father's 70th birthday, and my role wasn't changing. No anger. No pleading. Just cold, clear recognition. Understood, I said. I walked back to my desk. I opened a new document. I did not start writing the email yet. That would come later, after the presentation, after the moment that made the email not just necessary, but inevitable. But I opened the document, and I titled it, and I saved it to my personal drive. The title was simple. 4 words. I won't tell you what they were yet, because the story isn't there yet, and some things are worth waiting for. If this resonates with you, if you've ever watched someone collect credit for a foundation you poured, if you've ever been told your role isn't changing when what they meant was your ceiling isn't moving, make sure to like and subscribe. I share workplace strategy and corporate analysis every week that might just change how you navigate your career. Because what happened over the next 6 weeks at Helix Systems Group was not a story about one bad promotion decision. It was a story about what happens when 15 years of documentation meets one very public presentation and one very poorly secured projector cable. And I had been building toward it, without knowing it, since the day I wrote my first line of code for a company that was about to learn the difference between the person who builds the infrastructure and the person who just stands on it. What Brandon didn't know, what Craig Hollister didn't know, what Richard Whitfield almost certainly didn't know, because knowing would have required paying attention to something other than the org chart he was quietly reshaping around his nephew, was that the Orion Data Integrity Framework had an authentication layer that only I had ever configured. Not because I had hidden it, because no one had ever asked. Let me back up. In March 2022, 14 months before Brandon Whitfield arrived at Helix Systems Group wearing his first slim-fit blazer, I completed a security architecture review of the Orion framework as part of our SOC 2 Type 2 recertification process. The review identified a gap in our credential rotation protocol, specifically that the service accounts connecting Orion to our 12 enterprise healthcare clients were using static API keys that hadn't been rotated in 26 months. This was a compliance risk. I flagged it in writing to Craig's predecessor, a VP named Sandra Lim, who actually read her emails, and I built a solution, a credential rotation system I called the Orion Access Governance Module, which automated key rotation on a 90-day cycle and maintained an encrypted credential vault that required dual-factor authentication tied to a designated system administrator account. I was the designated system administrator. I documented this in the Orion Technical Specification, version 4.2, dated March 14, 2022, which lived in our internal Confluence wiki at a URL that I can still recite from memory and that Brandon Whitfield had never visited because I could see the page analytics, and in 6 weeks of his tenure as senior technical lead, his account had accessed exactly 4 pages of our internal documentation. One of them was the company holiday calendar. The credential vault wasn't a trap. I want to be precise about that. I built it because it was the right solution to a real compliance problem, and I documented it thoroughly because thorough documentation is what I do. The fact that it would later become the single most consequential piece of infrastructure in the story I'm telling you now was not something I planned. It was something I recognized quietly on the afternoon of the presentation. When I was sitting in my car on level 3 of the parking garage, watching the delivery confirmation on my resignation email, and thinking through what would happen to the Orion system in the next 90 days. The next credential rotation was scheduled for November 14th, automatic. Documented. Requiring administrator authentication that was tied to my corporate account, which had been deactivated at 10:03 a.m. on the morning I sent the email, per standard Helix offboarding protocol. I had not set this up to cause problems. I had set it up to prevent them. The distinction matters, even if the outcome is the same. There was one other thing Brandon didn't know. On September 6, 2023, 6 weeks before the presentation, 8 weeks before I sent the email, I had a conversation with Aisha Okafor, the junior engineer who had gently corrected Brandon's Kubernetes pronunciation and received a "that's what I said" in return. Aisha was 27, 2 years into her career, and possessed of the particular clarity that comes from being new enough to an environment that you can still see it accurately. She came to my desk after a sprint planning meeting where Brandon had assigned her to refactor a module of the Cascade Deployment Pipeline without providing any context, any documentation, or any explanation of why the refactor was needed. "Priya," she said, "I don't want to overstep, but I genuinely don't understand what he wants me to do. He said to optimize the pipeline's throughput velocity, and I don't. That's not a technical specification. That's not anything." "No," I said. "It isn't. Can you help me understand what he actually means?" I looked at her for a moment. She was holding a notebook with handwritten questions in the margins, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of engineer she was going to become. "I'll send you the Cascade architecture documentation," I said. "The original spec, not the summary. Read section 4 first. Then come back and tell me what you think he might have meant." She came back 2 hours later with a hypothesis that was correct. I told her so. She looked relieved, then thoughtful, then said, "Why doesn't he just read the documentation?" I didn't answer that. But I started, from that day forward, copying Aisha on every technical decision I made, every architecture note I wrote, every system update I documented. Not because I was planning anything. Because she was the kind of engineer who read documentation, and someone needed to make sure that knowledge didn't leave the building when I did. I just didn't know yet that I was leaving. 2 days after the email went company-wide, my phone rang at 7:14 a.m. I was making coffee. I looked at the screen. Brandon Whitfield, calling from his personal cell. I knew it was his personal cell because his work number had a 408 area code, and this one had a 310 Los Angeles, where his family was from, where his uncle had presumably taken a phone call the previous afternoon that had not gone well. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. I still have it. Priya, hey, it's Brandon. I wanted to reach out personally because I think there's been some, miscommunication around the presentation situation, and I want to make sure we can, recalibrate the narrative before it gets further amplified in the external ecosystem. The LinkedIn thing is, it's getting some traction, and I think if we can just get on a call and synergize around a unified response, we can probably de-escalate the optics pretty quickly. So just, give me a call. Or text. Whatever works for you. Recalibrate the narrative. Synergize around a unified response. De-escalate the optics. He was asking me to help him manage the public perception of a situation he had created by stealing credit for my work in front of 200 people. And he was asking in the language of someone who had learned communication from a crisis PR handbook and retained only the vocabulary, not the underlying concept that the vocabulary was supposed to represent. I did not call back. I did not text. I sent one reply to the voicemail via email because I wanted a written record. Brandon, I don't have anything to add to what I said in my resignation letter. Good luck with the Orion system. That last sentence was not a threat. It was a weather forecast. The first system event happened on November 3rd, 19 days after my departure. I know the date because Aisha texted me at 6:47 a.m., not to ask for help. She was careful about that, but because she had my personal number from a team offsite in 2022 and she was, I think, simply unable to process what she was watching without telling someone who would understand it. The text said, Orion threw 847 authentication errors overnight. Brandon is in a meeting with Craig right now. I don't think either of them knows what an authentication error is. I did not respond immediately. I made my second coffee of the morning and thought about the credential rotation schedule I had documented in version 4.2 of the Orion technical specification, which lived in Confluence at a URL that Brandon had never visited. The 90-day rotation had triggered at 2 a.m. on November 3rd, exactly as designed. The system had attempted to rotate the API keys for all 12 enterprise healthcare client connections. The rotation required administrator authentication. The administrator account, mine, had been deactivated on October 15th. The rotation had failed. The existing keys had been invalidated as part of the rotation initiation sequence, which was a security feature, not a bug, and which I had documented in Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Orion Access Governance Module specification. Also in Confluence, also at a URL Brandon had never visited. 12 enterprise healthcare clients were now running on a data integrity framework with invalidated API credentials. The system wasn't down. Orion was built with a 72-hour grace period before hard failure, another feature I had documented, but it was degraded, throwing authentication warnings on every data sync. And in a HIPAA-regulated environment, authentication warnings are not the kind of thing you let accumulate. The financial exposure was immediate and specific. Our largest healthcare client, Meridian Regional Health System, had a data sync SLA requiring 99.7% uptime with a penalty clause of $45,000 per hour for sustained degradation exceeding 4 hours. By the time Craig Hollister understood what was happening, which, based on Aisha's subsequent texts, took approximately 3 hours, Meridian was already in the second hour of degraded service. The penalty clock was running. Brandon called me again at 9:23 a.m. This time I answered, because I was curious what synergize around a unified response sounded like when the building was on fire. Priya, thank God. Listen, we have a situation with Orion. There's some kind of authentication cascade failure, and the team is, We're working to leverage our internal resources to resolve it, but we need some context on the access governance architecture, and I was hoping you could. Brandon. Just walk us through the credential rotation. Brandon. He stopped. The documentation is in Confluence. Version 4.2 of the Orion Technical Specification. Section 7. We've looked at the documentation and it's pretty dense and we're trying to. Section 7, I said. Paragraph 4. I ended the call. Not rudely. Just completely. By the end of that week, the authentication crisis had cost Helix $312,000 in SLA penalties across 4 clients, and the Orion system had been stabilized, not by Brandon, not by Craig, but by a contractor Helix brought in at emergency rates of $450 per hour who spent 2 days reading the documentation I had written and implementing the solution I had documented. The contractor's name was James Obi. I know this because Aisha told me, and because James Obi later sent me a LinkedIn connection request with a message that said, simply, "Your documentation saved my life." And probably Helix's. The client relationships were a different problem. Technical failures can be fixed with contractors and SLA payments. Trust is a different material entirely, and it doesn't respond to emergency rates. Meridian Regional Health Systems IT Director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, whom I had worked with personally for 4 years, sent a formal inquiry to Helix's account management team on November 7th requesting a technical briefing on the authentication failure and a written explanation of the personnel changes in the engineering leadership responsible for the Orion system. The inquiry was routed to Brandon, who responded with an email that Dr. Huang later described to a mutual contact as the most confusing technical communication I have ever received from a vendor. Brandon's email included the phrase, "We're working to optimize our system's resilience bandwidth," and contained no actual explanation of what had happened, why it had happened, or what had been done to prevent recurrence. Dr. Huang forwarded it to her CFO. Her CFO forwarded it to their legal team. Their legal team pulled the Helix Master Services Agreement and began reviewing the termination clause. Craig Hollister called me on November 9th. Not Brandon this time. Craig. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before, a tightness, a careful modulation that people use when they're trying to sound calm, and the effort of it is audible. "Priya, I want to be direct with you. We're facing some client relationship challenges that I think your institutional knowledge could help us navigate. I'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement, short-term, focused specifically on the Orion client relationships. We'd compensate you at a senior consulting rate." "What rate?" A pause. "We were thinking $200 per hour." I had built the system that was currently costing them $312,000 in penalties and potentially $4.7 million in the Meridian contract. They were offering $200 per hour. "No," I said. "Priya. Craig, the documentation exists. The specifications are thorough. If your current technical leadership can implement them, that's a resourcing decision, not a documentation problem." I ended that call too. Also not rudely. Just completely. 2 weeks in, Meridian Regional Health System formally initiated contract termination proceedings. The Meridian contract was worth $4.7 million annually and represented 31% of Helix's healthcare vertical revenue. Their termination letter cited material breach of service level agreements, inadequate technical communication, and loss of confidence in vendor technical leadership. That last phrase, loss of confidence in vendor technical leadership, was the kind of language that legal teams use when they want to be precise without being personal, and it was, in its precision, the most accurate description of Brandon Whitfield's 6-week tenure as senior technical lead that anyone had produced. Aisha texted me the day the termination letter arrived. She said, "The Meridian letter is circulating. People are asking questions. Specifically, they're asking about the presentation." The presentation. We hadn't gotten there yet in this story, and I realize I've been circling it. I'll get there. But first, I want to tell you about the phone call I received on November 14th from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Richard Whitfield's personal cell phone, because the CEO of Helix Systems Group called me directly. Without his assistant, without a calendar invite, without any of the institutional scaffolding that CEOs use to signal that their time is more valuable than yours. He called me from his personal phone at 7:45 p.m. on a Wednesday, which told me everything I needed to know about how the previous 2 weeks had gone in the executive suite. "Priya," he said, "I think we need to talk." "Mr. Whitfield." "Richard." "Please." A pause. "I owe you an apology." I waited. Apologies from people who have just lost $4.7 million in contracts have a specific texture. They're genuine in the way that things are genuine when the alternative is more expensive than sincerity. The promotion decision was I handled it poorly. Brandon is his family, and I thought he stopped. Started again. "I'd like to discuss bringing you back. Not in your previous role. In the role you should have had. Senior technical lead, full authority over the Orion and Cascade systems. Compensation package we can negotiate. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes." 6 weeks ago, it had taken 15 years and $34 million in contract signings, and I still hadn't been enough. Now it took $4.7 million walking out the door, and suddenly whatever it takes was on the table. "I appreciate the call," I said. "Is that a yes?" "It's an acknowledgement that you called." Before I tell you what I said next, and what Richard Whitfield said after that, and what happened to Brandon, and what the final number on Helix's losses turned out to be, you might be wondering something I get asked constantly. How do you stay calm when everything in you wants to say exactly what you're thinking? How do you hold that composure when the person who cost you 15 years of advancement is on the other end of the phone asking for help? That's exactly what I'll walk through in next week's video, because the answer is more practical than you'd expect, and it's the same skill that made the email work, that made the documentation work, that made every single moment of this story work. Make sure you're subscribed, because that video might be the most useful thing I've ever made. 3 weeks in, the situation at Helix had developed the particular quality of a controlled demolition where someone had forgotten to clear the building first. I know this not because I was watching. I had, by that point, accepted a consulting engagement with a healthcare technology firm in Austin called Viridian Health Systems, working remotely at $340 per hour on a data integrity architecture project that bore a passing resemblance to the Orion framework, for reasons that will become obvious. But because Aisha Okafor was texting me with the frequency and detail of a field correspondent, and because the Helix situation had, by week 3, become the kind of story that travels through professional networks the way water travels through a cracked foundation, quietly, persistently, and with increasing structural consequence. The simultaneous failures arrived, as simultaneous failures tend to on a Tuesday. The first was regulatory. Helix's SOC 2 Type 2 certification was up for annual review in November, and the certification audit, conducted by an external firm called Thornfield Compliance Partners, had been scheduled for November 19th. A date I had noted in my calendar before I left, and then, when I cleared my calendar, had simply observed with the quiet interest of someone watching a weather system develop from a safe distance. The Sentinel Compliance Engine, which I had built to automate SOC 2 evidence collection and maintain the continuous compliance monitoring that the certification required, had a reporting module that generated the audit evidence package. The reporting module required administrator credentials to compile. The administrator credentials were tied to my deactivated account. Brandon had not read the Sentinel technical specification. I knew this because Aisha had checked the Confluence analytics at my request, and Brandon's account had accessed the Sentinel documentation exactly 0 times. And so when Thornfield Compliance Partners arrived on November 19th, requesting the automated evidence package, what they received instead was a manually assembled collection of partial documentation that covered approximately 60% of the required control evidence, assembled over 72 hours by 3 engineers working from memory and whatever they could reconstruct from system logs. Thornfield issued a preliminary finding of significant control deficiencies and placed the SOC 2 certification on conditional status pending remediation. In the healthcare technology sector, a SOC 2 certification on conditional status is not a minor administrative inconvenience. It is the kind of finding that gets forwarded to client procurement teams, who forward it to their legal departments, who pull their vendor contracts and look for the clause about material changes in vendor compliance posture. 3 of Helix's healthcare clients had exactly that clause. Their legal teams found it within 48 hours of the Thornfield finding becoming known, which it did because compliance findings of that nature are not confidential, and because someone at Thornfield, I don't know who, and I didn't ask, mentioned it to someone in their professional network, and the professional network did what professional networks do. The second failure was financial. The Cascade Deployment Pipeline, which I had built to reduce release cycles from 22 days to 4, had a dependency management system that required quarterly configuration updates to maintain compatibility with our clients' infrastructure environments. The Q4 update had been due on November 15th. Brandon had not known this because it was documented in the Cascade Operational Runbook, version 3.1, in Confluence, at a URL he had never visited. By November 20th, 4 clients were experiencing deployment failures. The cumulative SLA penalty exposure was $218,000 and climbing. The third failure was Brandon himself, which is to say it was not a new failure, but rather the existing failure becoming visible to people who had previously chosen not to look directly at it. On November 21st, Brandon sent an email to Craig Hollister, Richard Whitfield, and the Helix Board's Technology Committee Chair, a woman named Margaret Osei who had joined the board 6 months earlier from a background in enterprise software and who had, according to Aisha, been asking pointed questions about the engineering organization since her first board meeting. The email was Brandon's attempt to explain the situation. I have read it. Aisha forwarded it to me with a message that said only, I don't know what to say about this. The email was 847 words long and contained the phrases synergistic compliance recalibration, bandwidth optimized remediation pathway, and, in what I can only describe as a moment of accidental poetry, the technical ecosystem is experiencing a period of transformative volatility. It contained no specific explanation of what had gone wrong, no timeline for remediation, no acknowledgement of the credential rotation issue, and no mention of the Thornfield finding. It did contain, in the third paragraph, a sentence that read, "The challenges we're currently navigating are in part attributable to knowledge transfer gaps created by recent personnel transitions." Recent personnel transitions. 15 years of architecture and documentation reduced to a knowledge transfer gap. Margaret Osei replied to the email within 4 hours. Her reply was 11 words. Brandon, can you please call me at your earliest convenience? 11 words. The kind of reply that contains a conversation the recipient is not going to enjoy. Brandon called me that afternoon. His voice had changed in 3 weeks. The performative confidence was still there, but it had developed a tremor underneath it, the way a structure develops microfractures before the visible cracks appear. Priya, I need to be honest with you. The situation it's more complex than I initially assessed, and I think there's an opportunity here for both of us to, Brandon, leverage our respective strengths to create a mutually beneficial. Brandon. He stopped. What do you actually need? A long pause. I need the Sentinel administrator credentials. And the Cascade Runbook update. And he stopped again. I need help. It was the first honest sentence he had said to me since his arrival at Helix. I noted it with the same quiet interest I had been applying to everything else. The credentials are tied to my deactivated corporate account, I said. That's an IT issue, not a documentation issue. The runbook is in Confluence. Version 3.1. The Q4 update procedure is in Section 9. I've looked at the runbook. Section 9, I said. Paragraph 2. Priya, I'm asking you. I know you are, I said. Good luck, Brandon. I ended the call. He had a lawyer contact me the following morning. The lawyer's name was Derek Finch, and his letter arrived via email at 8:15 a.m. on November 23rd, which was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, a timing choice that I found either strategically aggressive or simply thoughtless. And with Brandon, I had learned not to assume strategy where thoughtlessness was available as an explanation. The letter alleged that my resignation email had constituted defamation, that my deliberate withholding of critical system credentials and documentation had caused material harm to Helix Systems Group. and that his client was prepared to pursue damages of $2.8 million unless I agreed to a non-disparagement agreement and a consulting engagement at a rate to be negotiated. The letter used the phrase tortious interference with business relationships in a context that suggested Derek Finch had encountered the phrase recently and was enthusiastic about deploying it. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, a woman named Sonia Mehta, who had been my employment lawyer since 2019 and who responded to the forwarded email with a voice note that began with a sound I can only describe as a controlled laugh and then said, "Priya, this is not a serious legal threat. This is a document that someone paid money to produce. Let me respond." Sonia's response letter was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph noted that my resignation email had contained only factual statements about events that had occurred in a meeting attended by approximately 200 witnesses. The second paragraph noted that the Orion Access Governance module credentials were tied to a corporate account that Helix had deactivated per their own standard offboarding protocol, and that the documentation for credential recovery was available in Confluence at a specific URL, which Sonia included in the letter, because Sonia has a sense of humor that expresses itself through precision. The third paragraph noted that my consulting agreement with Viridian Health Systems had been executed after my departure from Helix and contained no non-compete provisions that would be implicated by Derek Finch's proposed non-disparagement agreement. The fourth paragraph said, in the language that lawyers use when they want to communicate something clearly without saying it directly, that if Brandon Whitfield wished to pursue this matter further, Sonia looked forward to the discovery process. Derek Finch did not respond to Sonia's letter. Brandon did not contact me again directly after that. The legal threat had the lifespan of a document that someone had paid money to produce without thinking carefully about what the response would contain. By week 5, the board had intervened. Margaret Osei convened an emergency technology committee review on December 2nd. I know what happened in that meeting because Aisha was asked to present a technical summary of the system failures to the committee, a request that had been routed to her because she was, by that point, the engineer at Helix with the deepest working knowledge of the Orion and Sentinel systems. Having spent the previous 6 weeks reading every piece of documentation I had ever written with the focused attention of someone who understood that the building was on fire and the blueprints were the only thing that mattered. She texted me before the meeting, "I'm about to walk into a board committee meeting to explain what happened to the systems. I'm 27. Is this normal?" "No," I texted back. "But you're ready." Section 7, paragraph 4. Section 9, paragraph 2. "You know this." She texted me after. Margaret Osei asked me who built the original systems. I told her. She wrote your name down. The committee meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Craig Hollister was placed on administrative leave pending a review of the hiring and promotion decisions that had led to Brandon's appointment. The review was framed, in the internal communication that Aisha forwarded to me, as a governance and process audit, which is the corporate language for, "We are trying to understand how this happened without saying out loud that we know exactly how it happened." Brandon called me one final time on the evening of December 3rd. It was 9:47 p.m., the same time I noticed that my resignation email had gone company-wide 7 weeks earlier. I don't know if that was intentional. I don't think Brandon was capable of that kind of symmetry. I think it was coincidence, and I noted it with the mild interest I had been applying to everything. His voice, when I answered, had lost the tremor. What was underneath the tremor, it turned out, was something quieter and more honest than anything I had heard from him before. He sounded tired. Not the performed exhaustion of someone who wants you to know they've been working hard, but the actual exhaustion of someone who has spent 7 weeks discovering the distance between what they believed about themselves and what the evidence showed. "Priya," he said, "I'm not calling about the legal thing. Sonia, your lawyer, she made that pretty clear." A pause. "I'm calling because I think I owe you something. I don't know if it's an apology exactly. I don't know if that means anything to you at this point." I waited. "I took credit for your work," he said. "In the presentation. I knew it was your work. I told myself I was building on it, that I'd added enough that it was." He stopped. "That's not true. I knew it was your work and I presented it as mine because I don't know what I thought. That it would establish me. That people would stop looking at me like I didn't belong there. The silence between us had a different quality than the silences in our previous conversations. Those had been the silences of someone waiting for me to capitulate. This one was the silence of someone who had run out of the energy required to be something they weren't. You didn't belong there, I said. Not cruelly. Just accurately. I know, he said. The documentation exists, I said. All of it. If you read it, actually read it, you could probably do the job adequately. Not well, but adequately. Another pause. Is that the closest thing to encouragement you're going to give me? Yes, I said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. Okay, a beat. For what it's worth, the email. The LinkedIn thing. I think you were right to do it. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say that the previous 7 weeks hadn't already said more precisely. Good luck, Brandon, I said. I meant it, in the way that you mean things when you no longer have any investment in the outcome. Within 48 hours of the board committee meeting, the consequences arrived with the specificity of a well-documented invoice. Craig Hollister's administrative leave became permanent termination on December 5th, following the governance audit's finding that he had approved Brandon's appointment without conducting a standard technical competency assessment, had failed to disclose the CEO's familial relationship with the candidate to the board's compensation committee as required by Helix's conflict of interest policy, and had approved a compensation package for Brandon that exceeded the approved band for the senior technical lead role by $47,000 annually. The audit finding was 3 pages. Craig's tenure at Helix had been 14 months. He had managed with the particular style of someone who had learned leadership from a podcast, and the audit had the quality of a final exam that the podcast had not covered. Brandon resigned on December 7th, 2 days after Craig's termination, in a letter that the internal communication described as voluntary separation. The letter, which Aisha obtained through means I did not ask about, contained the phrase, pursuing other opportunities, and was 94 words long, which was, I noted, approximately 753 words shorter than the email he had sent to the board committee 3 weeks earlier. Brevity, it turns out, comes naturally when there is nothing left to perform. Richard Whitfield issued a company-wide communication on December 8th acknowledging leadership transitions in the engineering organization and announcing a renewed commitment to merit-based advancement and technical excellence. The communication did not mention Brandon by name. It did not mention me by name. It mentioned the Orion Data Integrity Framework, the Cascade Deployment Pipeline, and the Sentinel Compliance Engine by name, which was the first time in 15 years that any company-wide communication had done so, and which arrived, I noted, approximately 7 weeks after I had left the building. The financial summary, which Aisha compiled from public filings and internal communications over the following months, Meridian Regional Health Systems contract termination cost Helix $4.7 million in annual revenue. 2 additional healthcare clients reduced their contract scope following the SOC2 conditional status finding, representing $2.1 million in lost revenue. SLA penalties across the Orion and Cascade failures totaled $618,000. The emergency contractor costs for system stabilization were $340,000. The governance audit and associated legal costs were $280,000. Helix's Q4 earnings call, held in February, reported an 18% decline in healthcare vertical revenue and a stock price that had moved from $34.20 on the day I sent my resignation email to $24.80 on the day of the earnings call. The total quantifiable impact of the 7 weeks between my departure and Brandon's resignation was approximately $8.3 million. Brandon Whitfield's annual salary in the senior technical lead role had been $187,000, plus the $47,000 overage that the audit had identified. Margaret Osei was appointed interim head of the Technology Committee's oversight function. Her first action was to commission a full technical documentation audit of all 3 systems I had built. Her second action was to authorize the creation of a dedicated systems administrator role for the Orion Access Governance module. Her third action, which Aisha told me about in a text that arrived on a Sunday morning while I was having coffee in Austin, was to ask Aisha to lead the technical onboarding for the new administrator. Aisha's text said, "She asked me to lead the onboarding." I said yes. "I wanted you to know." "Good," I texted back. "You're ready." "I've been reading your documentation for 7 weeks straight," she said. "I think I understand the systems better than anyone there." "You probably do," I said. "That's the point of documentation." A year later, I am the Chief Technology Officer of Viridian Health Systems, a role that was offered to me in March of the following year after the consulting engagement had demonstrated over 4 months. What 15 years at Helix had demonstrated over 15 years, that I build things that work, and that the things I build continue working after I stop being in the room. My compensation is a matter I'll keep private, but I will tell you that it is structured with equity, that the equity has a vesting schedule I intend to complete, and that the total package represents approximately 2.4 times what I was earning at Helix in a role that had not changed its title in 15 years. Viridian has 340 employees. I've built 2 new systems here: the Orion Data Governance Framework, which manages compliance monitoring for 23 healthcare clients across 4 states, and the Apex Integration Pipeline, which reduced our average client onboarding time from 34 days to 9 days, and which I documented with the same thoroughness I have always applied to documentation, because I have learned nothing from the past 2 years that has changed my view on the value of writing things down. Aisha Okafor was promoted to Senior Software Engineer at Helix in January, 4 months after Brandon's departure. She texted me when it happened. I told her she had earned it, which was true, and that she should make sure her promotion was documented in writing with specific performance criteria attached, which she found either paranoid or practical, and which I maintain is both. She is, by every account I have, the most technically capable engineer in the Helix healthcare division. She reads documentation. She writes documentation. She corrects mispronunciations when they occur and does not accept "that's what I said" as a response. She is going to be excellent. Craig Hollister is, as of the last information I have, consulting independently in the enterprise software space. His LinkedIn profile describes him as a strategic transformation advisor, which is the professional language for someone between positions, and which I note without commentary. Brandon Whitfield is working at a startup in Los Angeles. I know this because he connected with me on LinkedIn 8 months after his resignation with a message that said, "I hope you're well. I learned more from the 7 weeks after you left than from the 3 years before. I'm sorry it took that to teach me." I accepted the connection. I did not respond to the message, not because I was angry, I wasn't, and haven't been, but because there was nothing to say that the previous year hadn't already said more precisely than I could in a LinkedIn reply. He is, by his profile, working in a technical project management role. Not engineering. Not leadership. Project management. It is, I think, probably the right fit. Richard Whitfield remains CEO of Helix Systems Group. The company's healthcare vertical has stabilized, though it has not recovered to its pre-November revenue levels. He has not contacted me since the phone call in which he offered me whatever it takes, and I told him it was an acknowledgement that he called. I think about that conversation sometimes, not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes from having said the precise right thing at the precise right moment and knowing it while you were saying it. What I want to tell you, and I want to be specific about this, because the generic version of this lesson is everywhere and the generic version is not what I learned, is that the email worked because of the documentation. The resignation worked because of the systems. The outcome worked because of 15 years of writing things down, building things that functioned, and maintaining records with the same care I applied to the code itself. I did not win because I was angry. I was never angry, or at least I was never only angry. Anger is a weather event, and weather events pass, and what you're left with afterward is either evidence or the absence of it. I had evidence. I had version 4.2 of the Orion technical specification. I had section 7, paragraph 4. I had the Confluence analytics showing exactly which pages Brandon had and hadn't read. I had 15 years of performance reviews, project records, and documented accomplishments that existed independently of anyone's memory or goodwill. The thing about building systems is that they outlast the politics around them. The Orion framework is still running at Helix. The Cascade pipeline is still running. The Sentinel engine is still running. They run because I built them to run, and I documented them so that other people could maintain them, and the documentation exists regardless of whether anyone in the executive suite remembers who wrote it. The systems don't care about the org chart. They care about whether the credentials are valid and whether the rubbook has been read. If you've ever given everything to something and watched someone else collect the credit, if you've ever been told your role isn't changing when what they meant was your ceiling isn't moving, I hope this shows you something specific, that the work is the argument, but only if you've kept the receipts. Competence without documentation is a story you tell about yourself. Competence with documentation is a record that tells the story for you, in your absence, at exactly the moment it needs to be told. Like and subscribe if you found value here. I share workplace strategy and corporate analysis every week, the practical kind, the kind that's about what you build and how you protect it and what happens when you stop being in the room. Remember, the people who underestimate you are counting on you to have nothing in writing. Give them the documentation. Let the system speak. And when they call you at 9:47 p.m. asking for help with Section 7, Paragraph 4, you'll already know exactly what to say.